So this is Margot Fraser. I'm the Executive Director of ACE, and I'm very happy to have Linda Sagmeister here to speak to us on the CSA Z412 Office Ergonomics Guideline. So this is a guideline that's in review and update right at the moment. So Linda is former president of ACE and the current CCCPE president. And I will turn it over now to Linda to take it away.
Thanks, Margot. I'm really happy to be doing this actually because it's something that we work very hard on, these standards, and there are a lot of people who may or may not know about the standard and this guideline and any other ones. So I know before I started working with the CSA standards on and off, there was a lot I didn't know and I would have liked to have known. So hopefully this will help fill in some of the gaps anyhow. I guess, Margot, if you can answer me this, I'm going to ask everybody just to say how many people that are on with us now actually have a copy of this standard right now with them?
So if you have a copy of the standard, if you could just put a yes in the box, that'd be great.
No, so while
yes, no, yes, yes, no, 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 yes, no, yes.
Okay. All right, thank you. What about what?
We're at about 50%.
Oh, okay. So I thank you for those responses. I just wanted to get a feel. If you do have the standard there with you, feel free to go through with it because that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be kind of guiding people through it, and hopefully if you don't have it with you, the presentation will be somewhat explanatory enough to help you along. I'm going to talk a little bit about other things as well. I know that you're here for the Z412 overview, but I wanted to make sure that everyone kind of gains an understanding of where this standard is coming from and what it's been through, I guess, over its history. In order to do that, I want to give you some idea of the CSA itself, and then a little idea of how ergonomics and OHS standards fit in with what the CSA is doing and what it offers. I'm not an employee of the CSA, if anyone's wondering. It's just that I do a lot of work with them, which makes me a member, and I'll go over what that means as well. Then I'll talk about the actual standard, Z412, give you an overview of what's in it and roughly how it's meant to be used and what you can gain from it. And then tell you a little bit about what we're doing now with 412 so that you can see what we see on the committee as far as what we think the future looks like for 412. So, and as far as questions are concerned, I can't see your questions. So if you want to send them in as you go, Margot can see if there are a lot of questions and she can stop me. But if you don't want to do that, it's probably just as easy if you could keep your questions until the end and send them in, and I'll try to answer them then.
Yeah, so for the participants, there's both a Q&A box and a chat box. So if you've got questions, technical questions about what Linda's presenting.
Margot, are you still talking?
Box. If for some reason that doesn't show on your screen, though, it's okay to use the chat box. It's just a little bit easier on my end to see it in Q&A.
You've cut out, Margot, so I'm going to start talking. I hope that's okay. Hopefully you're not still talking. Try again if you are.
No, I'm not still talking. Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, the CSA group. So some things I'm not going to talk about the CSA for very long. Oh, and incidentally, this presentation is probably not going to be a full hour either. So the CSA group was established in 1919, as you can see, and one of the things that is kind of interesting, which a lot of people maybe don't realize, is that it's actually a not-for-profit group. It's responsible for a lot of standards development and product testing and so on. So most of us are really familiar with the CSA logo when we see it on our items that we use, like electrical items and so on. I think electrical is what comes to mind most for people, like your Christmas lights, speaking of which, and so on. But there are a lot of standards that people don't necessarily know about, but are actually shaping a lot of what we do in our workplaces and in our homes based on how these standards are developed and what they're saying to professionals on how things need to be done. So I'll tell you a little bit about the standards development. I don't know hardly anything about the product testing and certification and so on, except that it's pretty big. It's a big part of the CSA group. Not for profit, by the way, it means that the people who are doing a lot of the work are not being paid by the CSA. The CSA does have certainly staff, but they get supported by various groups and industry groups and legal groups or regulatory who want to see things done in a standard way to help avoid catastrophes, actually, and accidents and so on. So the CSA, this part on the right-hand side is what I really wanted you to see here, that they have 7,500 expert committee members, and they've got 3,000 standards and codes. So this is a pretty massive undertaking, and it just goes on and on. As far as standards development is concerned, it's an open and inclusive process, which means that there are no hidden agendas. It's very clear the way things are going to move forward. It doesn't mean that everything moves forward the same way. Every technical committee has its own sort of struggles or its own direction, but it's very well. It's pretty much laid out in terms of what everyone can expect and where we're going. Members, as I said earlier, are those people, those 7,500 expert people that they've got on committees, and not all of us are as expert as the others, but we are members, which means that we sit on committees and we do a lot of the work to try and put these things together. We provide the technical content of standards, and sometimes we provide administrative help and so on for looking at what we're actually putting together and coming together before it goes to the CSA for publication. Consensus is the major part that sets this apart, that makes it a unique, in my mind, a unique way of doing things. It's not just a vote to say, okay, well, majority rules. There has to be some debate and discussion between members of the technical committees, which I'll explain in a second, and decisions have to be reached by consensus. And that's a really important part of these standards. So whenever you do see a CSA standard, you can sort of understand that there are different perspectives rolled up into one standard, trying to walk the line between all of them so that their principles are being adhered to, and you have a product come out at the end. When the CSA needs to, when technical committees make the decision that international standards are relevant to what they're doing, excuse me, they can adopt international standards and have those as a part of a standard that they're developing for Canadians. Or sometimes they just outright adopt an international standard because one isn't necessary for Canadians in terms of changing it at all. So I'll show you how that worked with 412. The last thing you need to know on this slide here is that standards are voluntary. I recognize that regulations comment on and include a lot of CSA standards. There are tons of them actually, but they're not sort of born as a regulatory piece of. They're not documents that are meant to be necessarily included in regulations. They certainly can be, and they are, but a standard itself is developed as a standalone document which is voluntary, and the only thing that there is in there maybe is to give some normative statements, which I'll explain later, so people understand what you need to do, what parts of the standard are absolutely mandatory if you're trying to show that you have implemented it. Down the road, at some point, a regulatory body may decide to take it on and make it a regulation by quoting it or adopting it in their own regulations. Excuse me. Okay, so the CSA Technical Committee, which is what I keep referring to, is the core of a standard development. And the important thing to know about the Technical Committee is that there is equal representation, give or take one or two, generally among the stakeholder groups. Now, I have written here business, labor, regulators, and end users That's not necessarily the exact terminology that the CSA uses, but roughly speaking, it covers it. So you can see that you have groups here that may or may not have the same end goal. They usually do have the same end goal, actually, which is why they're sitting there trying to get this thing done. But they have maybe different principles, sometimes clashing, sometimes not, and that's where all that consensus comes in. So you can have a standard with like one paragraph in it that took several days to get to because of the kind of debating that has to go on to make sure we're all comfortable with it. Non-voting members on a technical committee come from all over the place. Their input is really important. It's very much appreciated and needed, but they may not have a vote. So in this case, we've got experts and industry reps and so on, and consultants. So the next thing I just wanted to let you know is that in terms of ACE's relationship with CSA technical committees, we have actually had people on technical committees for some time, but for many years it was unofficial. So what I mean by that is that people who were members of ACE found themselves on these committees for one reason or another. Myself, it was because my employer for one of these technical committees, my employer had actually asked me to be on it on behalf of them. On other ones, I was there just because of other interests, but in some cases, you're there as an actual rep, officially representing ACE, and that's more of a recent thing, I guess, over the last couple of 2 or 3 years, I suppose. So we've had official representation for ACE on the standards that I've got listed here. I could be wrong about the Z1003, but as I recall it, we had put a call out to the membership and didn't have takers. There were people on that committee for sure that are members of ACE, but I'm not sure that we had anyone there who was officially recognized as an ACE representative. And if I'm wrong about that, feel free to correct me when I'm done here, and I'll be happy to change that. Some of the structure, this is a proposed structure of the standards. Again, it's to get people to sort of see where this is all falling out. These standards are organized differently actually right now at the CSA. They're not necessarily organized like they are in this slide, but it's kind of where it's moving to. The curious thing here is that Office Ergonomics 412 was actually probably machine controls as well, but that was one of the first ones. And the way it's working out now is that it's going to fall under, in the flowchart, sort of under a hierarchy of other standards which have come long since Office Ergonomics. I think in 2006 the OHS Management 1000 came out, so that's the overarching management standard for OHS. And I have to also remind people that the Office Ergonomics standard, as well as the Workplace Ergonomics standard, were developed by the requirements of the OHS Steering Committee of the CSA. So in other words, they are meant to be developed with OHS in mind. So I know that there are a lot of people who feel that ergonomics is not necessarily a part of OHS, and I can understand that and agree, but in this context, it has to be within the OHS management context because that's what the CSA requested it to be, and that's the context in which they had all of the technical committee members come together. The CSA, by the way, is requested by groups to develop standards at times, and that's what Workplace Ergonomics was actually requested by regulating bodies, probably others as well, to have it actually specifically under OHS. So we couldn't deviate from that in that particular TC. You'll see psychological health is another management standard, I guess. Workplace ergonomics is a management standard. They all are sort of overarching, and then they have more application standards at the lower level, like the machinery controls, and you can see that there's probably going to be more someday down the road for psychological health and others. Okay, you're probably wondering when I'm going to get to 412. I will get there. The Z1004, again, because of this structure, I wanted to let you know about how I wanted to let you know how the Workplace Ergonomics Z1004 standard works. It is general workplace ergonomics. It is intended to just work with organizations so that they can fit an ergonomics process into their OHS management system. So it's not about here's how you set up a workstation, although there is information in there, but it's intended overall as a management standard, and it has appendices with application skills and application tools in it. The standard discussion, as in the parts where it says what you have to do in order to implement the standard, are more or less management related. It's meant to be motivation for organizations to try and put something in place that they know that they can meet some requirements, so it's not sort of all over the road and they know what they have to do in order to have this ergonomics process implemented. It gives them like a map really to follow. And then at the end, like I said, in the annex, there's an application tools and guides annex, which has a lot of the hands-on tools and checklists and so on, and references to other materials that people can use when they're actually applying the ergonomics on the shop floor, so to speak. And the principles that we used, which were intended for the reader to sort of situate themselves and understand where we're coming from with ergonomics, if they weren't already used to it and didn't already know what it was. These are the principles that we went with, and they were principles that were also in the ISO ergonomics and human factors standards, so that you can see here what they are. We're talking about well-being and performance being enhanced through ergonomics, and that it has its greatest benefit during design of a work system. And it also emphasizes the need and importance for user-centered approach. And last but not least, we have the worker participation being an essential aspect in ergonomics processes. The last bullet here was something that was under a great deal of debate in 1004. And again, it goes back to that thing where I said earlier that it had to be under the perspective of OH&S, even though there was debate about could we just leave that out, because it's not an ergonomics principle necessarily. But we did want people to understand, I guess, in the end, how it all fits together. All right. So here we are with Z412. For those of you who don't know, the 00 is indicating that 412, that the one I'm talking about, at least here, is the version that came out in 2000. There's my homemade picture there. It's the one that it's from our library here at work, as you can see by the big call sticker on it. But it's well used, and it's the current, well, actually the current version is reaffirmed in 2011. Looks exactly the same. So for a little history lesson, it was first published in 1989. There were tons of ACE members, I believe, already working on it then. And it was probably, I never actually got to see a copy of it, but I think it was much smaller than the one in 2000. I know that the changes that then occurred, the CSA has reviews. They usually review their standards if they can, if it works, every 5 years. It doesn't always work that way. In this case, this one was revised in 2000. And of course, from 1989 until 2000, there were, I don't know how many changes in technology and so on, and just the knowledge that people had of ergonomics and of MSIs and so on had really increased. So the need to improve it and change it and modernize it was really pretty strong by the time 2000 rolled around. So there were an inclusion. They included more devices that weren't there the first round, and they acknowledged this awareness that people were growing to have with the link between ergonomics and MSIs or MSDs, musculoskeletal disorders. They also included materials handling, which had not been previously in the 1989 version, because it was recognized that you're in an office, but that doesn't mean that you absolutely have to be just sitting there at your desk. There's obviously other things that you really need to take into account that people do in an office setting. And the big thing was the revision of 2000 moved to this process-oriented way of laying out the standard. And that's a really big feature of the standard the way it is now. In 2011, it was reaffirmed, and what that means in CSA speak is it was pretty much kept the way it is, but if somebody, people took the time to review it and make sure that it was acceptable for the time being, didn't need huge revamping, and there's probably a new prologue in the front, but generally speaking, it's the same. So an office ergonomics guideline. Usually, as soon as you say that, I think people sort of have this kind of picture in their head that jumps up right away, that you have a one-pager or a 10-pager maybe, with these kinds of diagrams telling you all sorts of numbers and things to look for. But that's not what it looks like at all. The really unique thing about Z412 is the way it's laid out. It's the funny part about it is it's actually called a guideline, but it's a standard. And the unique thing about it is this step-by-step process that's used within the book, and it is a book, and it's used so that you can design systems optimally. The standard itself, by the way, is about it's about 300 pages, and it's about a $218 purchase right now through the CSA, and that's if you want to compare it to something. Z1004 was 160 pages, and that's with the work in the back in the annex. So it is a big document, but it's very well laid out, and the article or the figure here on the right is one of the pages, and it starts off just by showing the reader with what all the steps are in the document. So it's too hard to read in the illustrations, so I wrote them out here. These are the first few, and you'll see that it works its way out kind of. So the office design outcomes was talking about essentially not the hazards, but what are the outcomes of having poor ergonomics in a workstation or in an office environment. So you can have all kinds of things like poor productivity and so on. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly let you read these, and these are the 9 steps, and then I'll go through the 9 steps with you just to give you an idea of what they're looking at, just to summarize them. And that's when I'll be going through the book itself. You might hear me flipping through pages, and invite you to do the same if you have it there. So if you have questions as we go through, you can also ask those at the end too. So again, just to say that it's going from looking at the what can happen if there is poor office ergonomics in place, what are the expected outcomes if there's good ergonomics, and then looking at the system itself, looking at your workers and their characteristics, looking at their jobs, their job design, and so on. Then you look at the layout and design of the actual rooms, the work rooms that people are in, look at the office environment, look at the individual workstation, review the whole thing, and provide education and training. So this is clearly a process that people need to go through. It's not okay, so how high should my chair be? Although that's kind of in there as well, but it's in amongst all the other important information as well. So looking at the steps, what we have is the first one, identifying office design outcomes. And the book is laid out so that you've got the steps clearly identified in the margins. And for those of you who are wondering, I'm on page 24 looking at it now. It defines the outcomes of quality that the quality of office ergonomics can influence. So we're talking about what happens if you have poor design. Well, you could have MSIs, you could have poor work performance, and you can have other conditions that can exist in an office system, which in my mind would be, there are also some psychosocial issues that could come out of it depending on how things are set up from a work organization perspective and so on. And so this actual step 1 has a few illustrations in it to say that you need to look at all these various things: organization, environment, job demands. It just sort of provides an introduction to workers and to anyone else who's reading this, to let them know about the breadth of issues that need to be considered when you're developing an office space. And this whole standard can be used in terms of somebody who's about to design one, somebody who's making changes to one, or people who are just trying to understand a little bit more about ergonomics itself. And it falls in that way. Z1004 kind of talks about the same thing from a management perspective. There's illustrations in here on how things should be set up, what types of postures should be avoided, cognitive demands are discussed, and at the end of each one of these chapters, I'll call them, or steps, there is a checklist that you can use, and some of them are very short and others aren't, but you can use this checklist at the end to say, okay, have I thought about everything I need to think about in terms of, in this case, and identifying office design outcomes. So it's pretty practical that way too, and at the end of the book itself, these checklists reappear for use, just by themselves. Step 2 is considering the office as a system and seeking an organizational involvement. So in this case, we move to the system area, the systems approach, which is very important and is often forgotten when people are really just worried about the furniture they're going to be in. So this has sort of a layout, shows what people should be looking at in terms, or what they should be considering as being part of a system. It talks about trying to get the involvement of appropriate people when you're developing these things. It's got an interesting table in it as well, which actually lays it out for those people who prefer tables. And it gives the groups of people that generally are present in an office system, and says what those people may need in order to play their role in the development of a good system, and then suggests what they need to do in order to fulfill those roles. It's nicely laid out that way, and there are then it moves on to be talking about ergonomics committees and the types of functions they would serve and who should be on them. And again, that has the checklist at the end, like they all do. Moving into step 3, this is where we start to identify worker characteristics and seek their participation. Essentially, it's telling the reader about anthropometry. It's telling them about aging and how people change when they age physically, and which will affect how the workstation and the work organization needs to be laid out and considered. It also talks a little bit about participation and how you can successfully involve people to participate. You can't just sort of tell them they're going to do it and expect it to happen. Talks a little bit about that approach that you could use, and then it talks about individual workstations and multiple user workstations. Again, it's describing how a workstation could change depending on anthropometrics, and clearly if you have more than one person using a workstation, you're going to need to take those things into account. It talks about aging, as I mentioned already, and then it has a little table about checklists, questionnaires, and so on, so tools for determining worker concerns, and it talks about which ones are better to use, like what are their pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. So you've moved now into understanding job demands and design and work organizations. So these are things that, again, tend to be overlooked, especially work organization, when people get too micro-focused. And this is a basic instruction to people on how to do task analysis and to consider the work organization that you're trying to put into place. It talks in this particular section, it talks a lot about, gives you a form to use for task analysis. It also talks about link analysis and gives you an example of what that would look like and how to do it. It's got an activity relationship chart as an example, so that it shows the interrelation or the interactions that people have with one another in a system setting, a work area. And then it talks about what kinds of things that need to be included when you're developing the work organization and design, in terms of variety and task completion and task significance. So these are hitting on a little bit of the psychosocial factors that might affect or be affected in work organization, and it allows people to understand the breadth, again, of what it is that we're developing and how people interact with what it is we're developing. We talk about flex time, shift work, overload, overtime, and then, of course, technology change. And there's a little sort of a nod there to get people to realize that Technology changes come with their own challenges. You can have software changes, hardware changes. All of them need either training or some kind of introduction to how to use them, and they may or may not be improvements. Changes aren't always improvements, so they need to be considered and figured out whether they're appropriate. Then there's step number 5, where we are now planning or considering the office layout and design of the work rooms. So this is not we're not yet down to the workstation itself. In this section, there is a review of building fire codes, floor plans, things to consider when you're talking about the actual work rooms, security considerations, and so on. What kind of partitioning should be there, and each of these things that I'm mentioning aren't pages and pages long. They're pretty short. They're to the point, and they just give the reader an idea of what to consider. At times, they also reference other standards to consider if you're going into more detail. In this case, this section also has handling aids. There are just illustrations of various handling aids and guidelines that come from the Eastman Kodak Company and Snook and Sorello as well. There's lots of information in this section that's pretty prescriptive, I guess. But I'll talk a little bit more in a minute anyways about what's prescriptive and what isn't when it comes to this particular standard. So step 5 is sort of heavy on the lifting and pushing and pulling and that kind of stuff, as well as the workspace in which you're going to be actually doing all that. Step 6, you plan or consider the office environment. So this is now where we're getting into the lighting, thermal environment, and so on. Again, this is a little bit like the last chapter in that it's going to either refer the reader to other standards that are more in-depth, or it'll give some information that people need to take into account as a first step at least. So there's information here about lighting, which comes from the IESNA Lighting Handbook. Then there's about sort of setting things up so that the lighting is correct and where the acoustic screen needs to be and restricting glare, all the sort of standard things that we all know you need to consider. It's talking about how to select the type of lighting. Talks about indirect and direct lighting. It also talks about color a little bit, and it talks about light measurements. There are acoustical environment pages. It talks a bit about what sorts of decibel readings or sound pressure levels you should be looking for in various workplaces, different types of workplaces. So we're looking at industrial or print room or quiet private office, which of course those things will change. There is a lot of information about noise levels, I guess, there is a lot of information out there on that, but it also moves into mechanical vibration and electromagnetic fields. So you can see that there are things in here that are possibly becoming a little outdated and may need to be updated soon. There's also indoor air quality, as well as thermal conditions and design strategies for acceptable indoor air quality. There are some of the standard quotes, other standards, like I said. So in this case, they have ASHRAE standards. So again, it's not constantly, not for every section will you get this kind of prescriptive information, but you do get a really good outline of what's in there and maybe where to go to get the information if you want more detail. Number 7 is the biggest one. That's sort of the mother lode step. It's pages and pages long. This is the one where people are talking about furniture and layout. So as you can imagine, it's one that most people are familiar with and might be one of the reasons why people even picked this up in the first place. So what the hope is that they would have picked it up and look at it and then seen that there is a process required to make it work smoothly. So you don't sort of come at it from the center out. You're supposed to start from one end and go to the other. This has a lot of illustrations about sitting and standing workstations, leaning postures, conditions for various workstation and posture choices. So things that people need to look out for depending on what kind of workstation you've got. Talking about line of sight. Work chair has got a ton of information in here, which is in text form. It also talks about other standards to look at, and then it gives more illustrated things. So you go from being able to read it in text, and then you can find it in standard or illustrations and tables and figures and so on. So there is an easy, quick access to information as well as more in-depth reading. It also talks about work surface configurations and so on, heights of work surfaces, and what kind of chair features there should be. So there you go. And then they talk a little bit about storage, accessories, or things that you have, like document holders and footstools, computer hardware. And one thing that it does not cover, which I'll mention later on anyways, is software. And computer, I don't believe that there is anything in here in terms of human-computer interaction fields. That's a huge field in and of itself. It talks a bit about notebook and laptop computers. Obviously, since 2000, there's been an explosion of changes there, so that will be something that will be looked at some point as well. Keyboard placement, adjustments of the chair, and so on. That is a very large and in-depth section where I would suggest most people are going to look for the hands-on stuff. Having said all of that and put all those things together for what you're considering, the next thing to do is to review the design that you come up with. So what this section is talking about is it's encouraging employers or organizations to consider having a mock-up or a user trial to ensure that what they're actually doing is going to be effective. It does give a little bit of a list of the design benefits for doing this and the disadvantages of doing it, like the fact that it could be difficult to find a prototype, could be difficult to get things that you can get on trial, but it also talks about why it should be done and when and how to do that. It gives some idea of the evaluation that you can use, the types of evaluations you can use when you are reviewing your design, and it's a fairly short section, but it's to the point. It just lets you understand a bit more about you shouldn't come up with a design, implement it, and then run away. You need to make sure that what you're doing is going to be appropriate when you do it. And step 9 is the sort of all-encompassing. This is not necessarily the last step to go at because people need education and training at all points throughout this process, but it is the last step in terms of how it's laid out in this book. It talks a little bit about adult learning principles and things to consider if you're going to be doing this step with your staff, that they're not little kids. It talks about trying to identify what the training needs really are. And interestingly, since this was put together in 2000, there's a new standard with CSA on OHS training. I'm not sure if people on the phone now are on the webinar. Some of you may have been involved in its development. So I think that will sort of cover a lot of what's being said in this step 9. But at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of information out there that we could use or that would be used with this OHS concept. It's very helpful. There's a table in here, table 21, which is saying how you can use this guideline, Z412, to actually develop an education and training program. So once you're using this standard, you can say, it lists here in the table which sections of the standard you should use to educate certain groups of people in your organization. So it helps to make it much more practical that way. So there you have it. That's what each of those sections has. And then at the end of this particular standard, there are, after a glossary and so on, there are appendices. So case studies is intended to show the difference between a bigger business and a smaller one and how they can both use the process. It just looks a little different, but it's essentially the same. It talks about anthropometric data, so there's lots of stuff in there that people can refer to in terms of some design implications. And there is a symptom survey, checklist for workstation dimensions that pretty much pools all the information together. That was discussed in probably section 7. And then at the end is that list of checklists. Remember I said that there's a checklist at the end of each chapter, and here they are again. They just reappear for easy use. Like I said earlier, this standard does not cover software design or the presentation of information on computers. There are other standards out there that do, though. Um, as you can see, this is clearly meant to be used in a step-by-step process. The recommendation is that people who might go and pick it up and say, let's just flick to page 100 and whatever, that really they need to at least become familiar with what the steps are trying to tell them first, so that they can see where in the process that certain step fits, so that they need to understand what it was that they may have left out before and things they need to plan on doing. Now, the interesting thing here is that, as I mentioned earlier, the CSA standards can adopt other standards, and in the case of the Z412 standard, like I said, it's almost like a textbook, and it gives a lot of information, a lot of tip of the iceberg information, so people know just how much stuff there is to consider and the basics that they need to look at. But it may not be the kind of detail that people are looking for necessarily where VDT or video display terminals are concerned, or I guess that's another terminology that's probably going out the window soon. But so what the CSA standard development came up with here in 2000 was that they would adopt parts of the ISO 9241 series, which is called Ergonomic Requirements for Office Work with Visual Display Terminals. So they adopted these parts that I've got listed here, and there are more parts out there, but these are the ones that Z412 adopted as theirs. So they really are a part of it. They are considered to be a part of this standard, but they're not all going to be published inside of the Z412. So when people need to have more detail than what Z412 gives them, it's considered to be an extension of 412 if they use these particular parts of the series of 9241. The parts are here as laid out. So there's an introduction to the series. There's task design for work with VDTs and so on, and it moves through very specific requirements and workstation layout and so on for things that you really want to see very specific on each element of your workstation. You have the remaining parts here, requirements for displays with reflections and so on, and you can see that these are probably being updated as we go as well, because these kinds of non-keyboard input devices and so on are all undergoing a lot of change in the market. And how we interact with them, of course, is changing too. The current work that we are doing right now, that the CSA is doing with the Z412, started a little bit, you know that the last one was 2000 and it was reaffirmed in 2011, but at the same time, even though they reaffirmed it, they sent out a survey to a wide number of end users because they wanted to find out where this is going, given the changes over the years in technology and so on. So they wanted to know what people think of the Z412 standard as it is now, get an idea of how many people actually use this step-by-step process, and what elements they thought should be updated or eliminated because of the changes. And the most really interesting question was, do people actually use the standard the way it was intended to be used? The survey went to a number of end users. You can see them all here. ACE was included. There was a SurveyMonkey link, I believe, that people could use to come back and say what their thoughts are on how this standard was looking. What the survey ended up saying, unfortunately, was a little bit unclear. When some of the responses were, what do you really like about the standard? And they might say Section 7, and then the next question was, what do you really not like about the standard? And they said Section 7. So unfortunately, it was not a very clear direction that we got from that survey. But except that it did sort of show that people weren't fully using it in a step-by-step process. There were groups of people who appreciated it, but most people just went to use it and took a chunk out of it and tried to apply it that way. So the current work that's going on with 412 right now is that it is being reviewed by a new technical committee. Not necessarily all new people, because there are people on the committee that have been on it all along, probably. But at this point now, the chair for the TC is Lucy Hart, and the vice chair is myself. About half of the members of the committee right now are ACE members. I'm not going to say who they all are. I don't have their permission to do that. But I can tell you that the official ACE representative is Jeff Wright, and there were tons of people. I shouldn't say tons of people, but there were a lot of people on the TC in 1989 who were already ACE members then as well. The changes that are coming up for 412 are possibly fairly significant. The major question that comes up for Z412 right now is always, is this a guideline or is this a standard? It's laid out like a guideline, but it's a standard, which is what CSA puts out. Like I mentioned earlier, when you say shall, when you use the word shall in a standard, a lot of you, forgive me if you already know a lot of this, but I just need to make sure that it's understood that a shall statement in a standard provides direction to the end user on the aspects of the standard that have to be completed and complied with in order for that end user to say, we are in compliance with this standard. So that means you're not going to comply with every single word in a standard, but you are going to comply with certain sections and requirements that are throughout the standard. And when you look at 412 the way it is now, there are very few shall statements, and they're not necessarily written in the context of a current shall statement in a standard. So what happens is it would be very difficult to adopt this standard in legislation for sure. But even without legislation, it would be very difficult for any employer to say that they are in compliance with the standard, because there's very few checkpoints, so to speak, with the shall statements to follow. It's currently process-oriented, which is a good thing, although we weren't finding that a lot of people really recognized that when they sent their survey responses in. It has a full narrative throughout, which is not usually the way standards are written. They're usually much more succinct and much more almost generic. Not generic, but there's not as many paragraphs and breakdowns and extra information on how to understand what's being discussed in the standard, although they do have those things in appendices. In this case, the appendices are further practical tools. It's a very practical standard. The way it is right now, it's very useful, very practical, and it's extensive. It is guideline-like in the way it appears, and it's the terminology that it uses is very guideline-like as well. So that's where it is right now. And so the TC had to look at it and say, well, the question here is, are we going to keep it this way, or are we going to move in a different direction? I've written here that it's tentative plans, because really we don't know for sure until it's published. We will not know necessarily where this all goes or how it looks. But the current thinking is that it should be moved into more of a standard itself, so that the shall statements in the normative sections, which is roughly means the same thing, will be far more obvious and much more in number, so that somebody who's reading it will know exactly what they need to do to stay in compliance with the standard. The elements that are changing so drastically since 2000 will be looked at again to see whether or not they are current, whether they need to stay, or whether there are other ones that are now on the scene that weren't then that need to come in. That means updating references and technology and so on. And the interesting thing, I think, too, is that there is a discussion about challenging the perception of what exactly an office is. It's not necessarily what everyone pictures. Going back to that picture of a guideline, it may not be that. It could be something different. If you work in your car, is that your office? If you work at home, how does that change? So there are lots of things to consider, and the TC is always considering them in our discussions, and it's sort of going back to check to see whether we are staying true to what we need to do. what we hope to do is to keep an annex at the back, or appendix, same thing, to keep the guidance material in one of those sections so that we don't lose this really valuable, practical, hands-on, step-by-step approach that we're looking at in Z412. But the standard part itself will probably be fairly short and to the point. We also then will achieve a better alignment with 412 into that flow chart I showed you earlier. It will not stand out quite so much as being totally different, which might make it easier to use for a lot of organizations, and that's, of course, what we are hoping they will do. So where we are now is we are developing those shall statements, which is the bulk of the work. We're all working in separate groups, and we're going to be coming together after December when we look at each other's work. We'll come together in early 2015, we're hoping. The goal is to publish in 2016. This is not all carved in stone, just so you understand. This can all change, but that's currently where we're kind of thinking we want to go now. And that's your tour for Z412. Does anyone have any questions?
So if you've got questions, could you put them into the Q&A box for Linda?
Pardon me?
So if you've got questions, you could put them into the Q&A box.
Is this where I find out the mic's been off the whole time?
No, it was on. I'm not seeing any questions coming in so far. Oh, okay. Someone's typing. Well, Peg's typing. I'll say thanks, Linda, for that overview and for those that
I can see
don't
that.
know, Linda's been quite for those that don't know, Linda's been quite instrumental over the past few years at also interacting with the CSA and I know this is an office ergonomic standard, but kind of pushing them to see that ergonomics belongs in many of the other standards that they work on. Sometimes we don't find out until the last minute, but we were able to get a voting member, Maury Hill, onto the new incident investigation and prevention standard, which just had their first meeting last weekend. So we keep chipping away at that.
I see a message here from Peg, and I really appreciate that. Especially coming from you, if I'm correct, you were on the 1989 one, were you not? Oh, sorry.
So is there anything else, Linda, that you want to add just generally on the CSA?
No, well, yeah. I guess I just want to share with people that becoming a member isn't an onerous task at all. Really, all it takes is wanting to go and do some work on this stuff. Uh, it's easier when you're supported by your employer, clearly, because it takes a lot of time. But if ACE puts out a call for membership on these things, I think it's really, really worth it to go for it if you can afford the time and so on. Because not only is it really helping the profession, but it's really just it's such a rich experience. The number of people you meet and the things that you learn and the ability to have some kind of input in the way these things go is really worth it. I can't emphasize it enough. So when there is a chance for ACE to be involved, and CSA starts seeing what kind of work we can do and what kind of input we have, it's going to be amazing. I really hope people can come forward for these things.
So there's some questions in the Q&A box now. If you just click on the person, it should open up for you on your screen.
Would you recommend anyone buy this standard given the revision is underway? Lucy. Actually, I think I would, because it depends on what you need it for. If you like the process, step-by-step process, and you need it for sort of the basic understanding of what the breadth of ergonomics is in an office setting, or even otherwise, I still think it's worth it to buy it now and use it, especially if you need something before 2016. But in the meantime, you would have to buy it with the knowledge that you are going to get something that it could drastically change in a couple of years. But it won't. But the principles that it's based on won't change. The principles are the same. There's still ergonomics principles, and so I would say yes, it would be very valuable, unless you're looking for something that you can enforce. If you want to enforce it, and I don't mean legally necessarily, but if you want to enforce it in your workplace, I wouldn't recommend that it's the most useful tool for that. I would say wait then in that case. Mike's question: have any of the standards referenced, example ISO, changed since CSA? Yes, yes they have. The ISO standards that the Z412 adopted have changed, not necessarily every one of them, but they do change kind of on the same frequency that CSA standards change. And it's not always a given that they will stay to that schedule, but they have changed, I think, in this case. So again, because they're based on technology, and the technology has really changed. So I would make sure that you're getting the most recent ones of those as well. Okay. So I'm losing my host capability in 5 minutes here, I think. Christine, Linda, in regards to the survey responses you received, were there responses from facility designers, and what were their opinions? Did they use the standards at all? Good question. Facility designers, I can't say for sure that they were in that list of people who received it. There was a breakdown of the types of groups that answered the survey, and a lot of them were government and OHS and consultants. Now, the facility designers could have been in there in any of those things, I suppose. So I can't say for sure whether they were in there, and then if they were in there, definitely can't say whether they were using the standard at all. Unfortunately, the data we got couldn't be broken down all that easily, which was a bit of a disappointment. So we may need to do something like that again sometime in the future. Oh. And the Anthro data in 2000 is not the most up-to-date available. Speaking of up-to-date information, definitely not, because of, well, Lucy just did a presentation on that a couple of weeks ago, I think, showing that anthrometrics data is, at least for her, what her topic was, for the BIFMA standards and guidelines, they're not using the same ones that they used here in 412 anymore. My understanding is it's CSER now, more up to date. Should I continue? Or there's more questions here. Question from Sue: how can one get more involved on a TC? It would be great to get some experience on the process. Well, if you're doing it through ACE, you need to keep on top of when there are announcements, which is usually posted in emails or on the website, or both. You can also phone CSA and ask them that question so that they start sending you information about what is being developed, and then you would know whether you have some expertise to offer and get on the committee that way. And if you're not working for yourself, if you have an employer that you can ask about it, then with their support, it's usually a little easier to get on, uh, because the CSA is very limited in terms of what it can and will spend as well, because they're not for profit. Okay, I do have a last question here from Sue Street about CSA, and what I'll do is send you an email with the contact and information from CSA. Does anyone else need anything else then from that?
Watch all the typing going on. So while people are typing, it may just be thank yous and so on. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Linda, for all your input. So you know what's upcoming. We will be continuing with the webinars in 2015. Thanks to everyone who completed the member value survey in English. For members that are on who French is their first language, or their preferred language of communication, that survey is out right now. We'd love to get your feedback if you haven't already answered it. So some of the webinars we've got coming up, we've got forensic biomechanics and accident investigation. Rob Parkinson will be doing that. Probably something on sit-stand workstations. In French, hopefully Catherine Lepel will be doing something on what ergonomists need to collect in Quebec in terms of reports if they want to be expert witnesses. And we have an expert in automation and autonomy looking at that in unmanned aircraft, which I think the general lessons will apply to control rooms as well. So how much control do you give to a person and how much control do you give to a machine? I guess last announcement for everybody on is the ACE member. We have been looking also into professional insurance because we know it's expensive through our provider now, and we've fortunately found someone who it looks like our rates are going to be under $200. That announcement will be going out in the next few days. So for those of you that need professional liability insurance, hopefully we'll have something that's a lot more valuable to you coming very soon. So anything else, Linda, on your end?
No, nothing except thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.